Our next presenter has worked in IT management for over 40 years. He is researching DevOps, DevSecOps, IT risk, modern governance, and audit compliance. Previously, he was an evangelist at Docker Inc., VIP of solutions at Socket Plane, sold to Docker, and Stratius, sold to Dell, and VIP of training and services at OpsCode, where he formalized the training, evangelism, and professional services functions at the firm. Additionally, he founded Gulf Breeze Software, an award-winning IBM business partner specializing in Tivoli technology deployment. As an author, he has written 6 IBM Red Books on enterprise systems management and 4 books for IT revolution, including the DevOps Handbook. He is working on his latest book, The Operational History of Generative AI. Please welcome on stage John Michael Willis.
Thank you, buddy. All righty.
The title of his presentation is Learning from History, the Past as a Compass for Systems Engineers in the Age of AI.
And if you can't tell, that was generated by generative AI, so that title. So when you get stuck on a title, you give it your presentation and say, give me a better title name. Yeah, I'm Butch Gloop. I've done a lot of things. Most notably, I sold a company to Docker. I sold a company to Dell. I was on the executive team on Red Hat. I was the old guy at Chef. And I'm considered one of the founders of DevOps. I wrote a lot of books, probably most notable, the DevOps Handbook, co-authored with Gene, Patrick, and Jez Humble. Did a bunch of cool books after that. Some people, I think there's 10 people who might have bought Beyond the Phoenix Project. Investments Unlimited is about DevOps automated governance, really interesting story. And I'm a Deming freak. So if you want to know about the arc of Deming and why he might matter today in cyber, might be a good book for you. All right, so I just spent the last year and a half, 2 years writing a book about the history of AI and the rebels of reason. And that is sort of the core of this presentation, although I'll have a little bit of fun at first. I think that the more I look at the daily changes and the structures and the things that are happening, not understanding the history of AI is literally our bottleneck, to speak Steve terminology. So just sometimes in your career, really interesting things happen that don't matter a lot to anybody else except yourself. But about 3 weeks ago, they did a roast of me in the DevOps days. And it was an honor to be roasted by your community, right? And it was pretty terrible. They made fun of me pretty good. But I figured I'd roast myself in that event because I was the keynote speaker. And so I'll tell a story. It was the first US DockerCon, or second US DockerCon. I was given a presentation. I just sold a company. And for some annoying reason, and pro tip to young speakers, never make this pose. Because for the next month, there were a bunch of kids that memed the crap out of me. Yeah, there I am with Devo, and I was trying to save the world. I am old, but and then there's me scuba diving, and then my hero. But if you don't know Andrew Clay Schaefer, you should. You should basically write it down right now and read everything he's done. One of the best presentations ever given on DevOps is a presentation called There Is No Talent Shortage. But the reason I tell this story is we had a gamble/bet that we made over 15 years. I lost. I had to jump out of an airplane with him. And that was us hugging each other because we survived. But what the real is interesting, he gave this presentation, which was supposed to be a roast. And his presentation was like how we get hung up on all the terminology, like is it lean? We've heard that shit out of this today. I'm going to cuss a few times today, I know. Even Charity Majors held back on saying the F word, but sorry, it's late in the afternoon, you might hear some cusses. So he was talking about how the mess, and I've heard this mess all day today about agile, lean, panel, screaming, hollow, right? And that's great. But Andrew literally said this, maybe the real DevOps are the friends we make along the way. And I think that, to me, I talk about guys like Steve, and there are other people here like Patrick, that, to me, that's what's been great about DevOps. But what about this presentation? I think there are 3 things that, why I'm trying to present this, and I'm trying to evolve it. I think there's an historical argument to understand, and that's what my book is all about. My book goes into deep, literally almost 100 years of history. First neural network was created on a paper in 1943. I think epistemological argument. I'll tell you a story how I got roped into that. And then there's an ethical argument, but to be perfectly honest with you, I don't really get into it. I had a Stop Killer Robots chapter, but I took it out of the book because I just don't want to let other people argue, debate AGI. And I think like every breath that you take discussing AGI is wasted time. So the historical practice, I read 25 books. I've listed all of these in order of, I think, how important they are and how I learned. So there is a LinkedIn post that actually puts these in order. This is not in order, but this spent a lot of time over the last 2 years really trying to understand this history. And one of the things I found, which was very difficult if you were going to write the history of AI, which was it wasn't linear. There's multiple types of AI. There's what they call symbolic. There's sub-symbolic. There's overloaded terms where symbolic is sort of expert system and sub-symbolic is neural network, right? So if you didn't know that, you just learned a little pro tip. And the problem was that as a writer, and I've written, I think now, if you add them all up, probably 13 books, you don't want your readers to have whiplash on timelines. And so one of the things I realized is I'd get to one story, and then I'd have to go back 30 years, and I'd get to this story. And one of the things I realized in order to make this book, I broke it out into the senses. AI can count, AI can think, AI can learn. And these were really all important pieces of the history, because it wasn't just a neural network paper, perceptrons, LeCun, and Hinton, and we're off to the races. There was a lot of other stuff going on in between. We talk about the godfathers of AI. And so, and then really quickly, if you're interested, there's a lot of really interesting diversity characters in this narrative that are not in any of those 25 books. By the way, I can start with Grace Hopper. And I won't, I'm going to run out of time, but she is, you'll know History of AI book includes her in the history of AI. But she's the first one to take language as an abstraction for bits and bytes. But the probably most interesting person is Dr. Fei-Fei Li. You don't have ChatGPT in 2022 without Fei-Fei Li. If you want to know more, you got to read my book. This was in 1943, the first paper that described mathematically how the brain might work through calculus, or really Boolean logic, but they called it calculus. And so I'm going to start with a story, and then I'll get into sort of more details. So this guy, anybody know who this guy is? There's a free book. There's a couple of books I'm going to give away. But yeah, I wouldn't expect. He probably is one of the top 5 20th scientists, and nobody knows who he is. He was the co-author of that paper that described the first neural network. But what's interesting about this guy is that at 13 years old, he was homeless, uneducated, spoke 3 languages, including Sanskrit, learned on his own. Basically was in Detroit, got chased by a gang. He hid out in the Detroit Public Library, and he had to stay there for a few days because I think he might have got killed if they found him. And so he just happened to pick up Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica, the 10-volume one, and sent Bertrand Russell a letter giving him corrections, right? And Bertrand Russell sent back to him, why don't you sent to the library, why don't you come over to Cambridge, not realizing he was a homeless 13-year-old, right? Well, so he starts going into really important people and start yelling at them for how they're wrong. He winds up working with some really important people that ultimately lead him to Norbert Wiener. So if you know who Norbert Wiener is, he's the founder of cybernetics. By the way, AI should have been called cybernetics, but John McCarthy was sort of an asshole and decided he called it something really stupid like AI. Here's the narrative here. So this guy, he would work with 2 brilliant scientists at night, all night, And plus, they were bohemian, like parties, jazz music in the 40s. This is terrible stuff, right? Smoking pot, probably doing psychedelics like acid and stuff like that. And during the day, the two other scientists, one would go teach biology to pre-med students, University of Chicago, and the other one would go teach psychology and neuralistic and all of this emerging stuff that was happening. And you know what he would do? He was a janitor. They got him a job as a janitor. So this is a real life Good Will Hunting. And by the way, like the importance of his narrative, again, without this guy, there is so many things that don't like click. Why now? I think Simon said it in his keynote really well. Resistance is futile. I don't disagree that there are zillions of dragons and all this stuff. Right? There's a lot of danger points. But to sit around and act like we can't do this or we're not going to do that, it will never be better than that, it's nonsense. It's happening. Market pressures are going to demand that you're going to do it. Your CEO is screaming and hollering of why we're not doing it because our competitors are. So you can make all the Luddite-like arguments you want. And I'm not saying they're not valid. And so here's one of the things I love. So you know what I heard a ton of times today? Is a bastardization of the term hallucinations. Because let me tell you something, folks. Humans hallucinate. It's how we have conversations, right? We have to create abstractions. If you know physics and I don't know physics and we're going to have a conversation, you don't start telling me the gory details of physics. You give me sort of hallucinations of abstractions, all right? There's a longer conversation here. But let me tell you an exact example. I got to talk to and work a little bit with LabCorp in the US, and the guys who were going to basically replace the help desk. And the help desk at LabCorp is the help desk, the 24-hour, where patients, or not patients, but doctors and nurses call in to understand lab results. This is critical stuff, right? Because those answers are critical. They're blood tests for patients. And so he spent a year building an AI system, a remediation system, to replace those humans. So it gets to go to the board, it's ready to go time, they put the tea time, you can't do this, people may die. And he said, wait a minute. One of the things he knew ahead of time was he knew the humans were worse than his system. You know how he proved it? He took the 5 years of all the transcripts of all the calls, and he ran something I'm going to talk about later, which is called evaluations, and he compared the correctness, these sort of computational, quantitative and qualitative metrics that you can use to calibrate correctness. In other words, calibrate hallucinations. And he found, and he proved, that the new system he built was 10% better than the last 5 years of the humans answer the question. Right? So let's take a look at benchmarks. There's two benchmarks that I think are really, benchmarks are bullshit unless you want to make a point, right? It's kind of like Gartner's bullshit unless they agree with you and you want to use it in your argument. But the point here is there's two that I think are interesting. GPQA is basically a reasoning benchmark, right? And in this benchmark, in June of 2024, the leading on the benchmark was 60%. We're sitting at 84. This is 2 weeks old. It's probably higher than that right now. But human eval is even more interesting because that's coding. So again, I agree with Simon again, Jevons paradox. We're not going to replace, coders are not getting replaced. But to argue that humans code better at scale than AI, sorry folks, it's nonsense. And this proves it. Literally right now, at human eval was 70% in June, and it's basically the top 5 models, again, this is about 3 weeks old, are literally sitting within a point of 99%. Now, I agree there's architectural design positions, and I'm not going to say the V word today, but the point is there are a lot of considerations of taking code and putting it in production. Trust me, I've been doing infrastructure and operations for 45 years for some of the largest corporations in the world. But the point is, as raw coders, you cannot make the argument. Because here's another thing. If you got, the Capital One at one point had 20,000 Java developers. 20,000 Java developers. You think all those Java developers consistently produce at 99%? If you should leave now, honestly. I want you out of the room. Because the thing was, they don't. And even if you don't agree with the benchmark, the thing that you can't disagree is it's going to be consistent. And that's something we don't get out of humans. So, I mean, I hate to sound like a defeatist but we have to start realizing how to work with these systems as opposed to oppose the system. And for you DevOps folks, there's something called the SWE bench, software engineering bench, about how well AI can take an issue from GitHub and solve that problem. There was somebody talked about it yesterday. In March of 2024, the leader on the board was 2%. Right now, the actual, and then in April, a product called Devin came out. Patrick Dubois did a great job yesterday talking about some of these tools. Right now, the leaderboard is at 60%, less than a year. And I'm telling you, if you've tried it, you go into an issue, and if the issue is well-defined, because if it's not well-defined, nobody's going to fix it. A human or the context matters. I mean, we're sitting at 60%. That means we can start, AI can resolve a lot of issues, and to ignore that AI can do that is. So then what does this sort of mean for the sort of DevOps in me? The DevOps is, okay, CIO, stop ignoring this, pay attention, and deal with it, right? And deal with it means that you have to start looking at this thing as like it's happening, so therefore what do I do? Because this happens over and over. 2 years ago, I wrote an article called Shadow AI. You know why? Because I lived blood and guts and scars from Shadow IT from cloud. And it took us 10 years to clean up that mess. Because what did they say in the beginning? Oh, you will never use cloud in this organization. If I could show you the list of companies where CIOs told me there will never, ever, ever be cloud in this organization, and show you every one of them is running more than 30 to 40% of their infrastructure in cloud right now. Right? So there's a lot of opportunity to learn from the past. So we wrote a paper. So one of the things I co-wrote a book with Gene Kim, and then we wrote a book together, and I published a fair amount of books in his publishing organization. But we get together every year, and we sort of talk about hard problems. And one of the hard problems we spoke about 2 years was this idea that CEOs are hiring chief AI officers, and chief AI officers are hiring students from, most of the chief AI officers are sort of big shots from a university. And that's great, because you need those. And they hire really brilliant kids out of Stanford and CMU and whatever the greatest engineering college is over here. And what they don't know is how to protect the brand. They don't understand infrastructure and operations. They don't understand things that people like Steve and I and most of you, some of you, have been doing for years. In fact, it's even worse because the CEOs are telling the chief AI officers, oh, by the way, stay away from the CISO. They're going to slow you down. I mean, this is like what happened in cloud. And so terrible, terrible, terrible things are happening and will continue to happen until the CIO, and so if you've read the Phoenix Project, this is a Phoenix Project kind of novella, if you will. I've got a newsletter where I sort of document everything I can try to tell, from jailbreaks to what adversaries are doing at AI, and I don't have the time to talk about some of these. I mean, the adversaries now are like, if you thought they were bad 5 years ago, they are on steroids right now. The way they can pwn you. So where do we go? And here's the other thing, right? All right, I said I wasn't going to say the V word. I won't. You can figure out what the V word is. It isn't whether you, all right, it doesn't matter whether you vibe code or not. That's not the point. The point is, prototype does not equal production. And if you ever read Eric Ries's stuff back 15 years ago, minimal viable product, right? We know that. We can still prototype. Don't conflate prototyping with production. And so there's a technical debt tsunami coming. Worse than anything we've seen before. Because, by the way, AI, if I'm being generous, is 80% network compute and storage. Sorry, folks. It's cloud native on top of that. And that last 10% is all this really cool Python and Node stuff. I mean, it's spectacular stuff. But at the end of the day, there's electricity driving compute, storage, and networking. Those are existing. And by the way, We're terrible at that stuff. And by the way, now we're going to have tons more code of things that we're already terrible about. And we've got now these whole new adversarial attack vectors from things that are basically probabilistic. And so how many, you may not have heard the Air Canada story, right? The Air Canada story is interesting, right? So I won't go into too much detail. I have longer presentations or workshops where I talk about RAG and evaluations, but basically they built a RAG, right? So it's a vector of all the information. And they scraped everything. That's the first clue of how things could go wrong. They scraped everything. And one of the things they scraped was a system of record of policy of refunds for passengers. Another thing they scraped was an FAQ, which was kind of people on Saturdays saying this answer versus that answer versus. 99 out of 100 times, the inference of a question would have probably given the system a record. This one particular time, this young man who didn't have any money, his mother died, he wanted to go back to her funeral, and he asked his inference question, just happened to get that other source, and said, would I get a refund if I had to go back for a funeral? He was told yes. He went ahead and bought his ticket, went to get his money, and they said, nah, that was the AI. That's not what we do. And then, so here's the real thing. Like, at the worst possible time to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about giving bad answers, basically Air Canada is on the front page of Wall Street Journal for about a couple of weeks, almost every day. By my napkin math, they lost $500 million in market cap because of brand reputation. And here's the thing. You know what the payout was? $800. Like, don't be Air Canada. I mean, people tell you, take everything and throw it into an LLM. No. There's a term that came out. LinkedIn did a study a year and a half ago. It's called BYOAI. So in the cloud days, if you had a 100,000-person organization, the truth was probably less than 5,000 were going to use, especially in the early days of Amazon Cloud. It was an API-only interface. There was probably less than 5,000 people that were really were going to use cloud in anger. That's not true in this world. If you've got a 100,000-person organization, you're going to probably have 70,000 people using AI. Right? And that was my theory, and LinkedIn confirmed it. So again, when I say there's a technical debt tsunami coming, if you think about hard, or if you read anything, and if you didn't experience the cloud massacre, this is like 2.5 orders of magnitude of complexity. All right, I got enough time to tell you this is the coolest. There's a ton of jailbreaks. If you want to understand jailbreaks and you're doing RAG and you're doing things, you should really pay attention to RAG. In fact, I'll show you the OWASP LLM top 10, which is a good place to start. But this one, is freaky. So, and it is the point that I'm trying to make about the danger zone here. So basically, Wiz did a bunch of good white hat hacking. So one of the things they did is they built an inference model, an embedding model, that they purposely poisoned with basically something called Python pickle, which allows you to escape out to the operating system. They put it on Hugging Face, an example. They ran it themselves, so they were able to break out of the inference to the OS. That OS was running on basically a plain vanilla Kubernetes install, non-hardened. So it took them nanoseconds to break out of that. Because it's what the kids that built Hugging Face, sorry if anybody's at Hugging Face, and if you want to disagree with me, let's have that conversation. They probably never heard the word DevOps. So they didn't harden it. So it was like nanoseconds to break out of Kubernetes. And guess where they wound up? This is all documented. They wound up on a shared customer Amazon host by just doing a query against an embedding model on Hugging Face. And that's the tip of the iceberg here. There are people putting 0-byte codes. You have Struts 2, that whole vulnerability, how they were able to escape out of a URL. Well, this stuff is in PDF 0-byte codes that will execute scripts on your operating system just by reading a PDF, loading it into a vector, and doing an inference question against it. And by the way, again, this is just another point of, this is Bedrock. Again, I don't apologize much because I don't give a shit, but like Bedrock is terrible. I'd go Vertex, but like the point of this is that if you read that, the Bedrock infrastructure, that's network, compute, and storage. Like drill in on any one of those pieces. There's a whole lot of cloud native in there. There's Kubernetes, there's Kafka, there's Redis, there's, so like that stuff doesn't go away. And if you're terrible at managing it before Gen AI, Bob's your uncle. All right, so I told you that if you want to, this is a great education. So if you are moderately or a highly regulated organization, and your leadership is telling you have to go Gen AI, you have to read this paper. Okay, and that paper will take you to MITRE, it will take you to what NIST is doing, and it will educate and it will scare the hell out of you, but like I said earlier, you're not going to stop your CEO from making you do it. But at least now you can mitigate the risks, or at least attempt to mitigate the risks. And why is this not going? Anyway, I won't go through all these, but it has an amazing prompt injections, sensitive data, supply chain attacks, data model poisoning, misinformation, leakage, vector embedding. I talked about vector embedding weaknesses. So one of the things I started thinking about, like, how do I make a narrative of this? I can either scare the hell out of a CIO, but I also have to inform them to be able to get up to speed. This is what that paper was about. Like, they can't just storm in the chief AI office and start telling them to stop doing anything if they don't know the terminology. They don't even understand what the stack looks like. And I'm old enough to remember something called the LAMP stack. And the LAMP stack was critical for everybody to get on the same page about what was going on in web services in the early 90s. So I call it normal. And so, and in the end is just a good friend of mine said, I originally call it LARMA, and he said, that's a terrible acronym. He said, why don't you call it normal? And so N is N ways, so at each level in the stack, there are multiple choices. But we start with observability. And the thing is that the first problem we have as an industry is the ML people who have been doing evaluations, when they started marketing into everybody else in the world, they figured, hey, observability sounds like a great term. And so what you have now is you have this conflated term where, to a lot of people on this planet, they think observability is honeycomb and Dynatrace and all that. To the ML experts, it's something called evaluations. It's software that actually can use computational, quantitative, and qualitative analysis to judge the correctness, the bias, and toxicity of the answers that you get. This is science. This isn't like people just saying it hallucinates, and my God, it hallucinates all the time. No, it's geometry, folks. It's a matrix of vectors that are basically, when you're asking your questions, it's looking for the closest distance of the next word, the next sentence, the next paragraph. That's what it's, I mean, it's way more complicated than that, but from a layman's perspective. So observability is this evaluation. I kind of want to change RAG to sort of XAG, which means, like, people talk about RAG, and then there's an argument that RAG is dead. RAG is not dead. RAG is another tool in your toolbox. It's another way to reduce hallucinations. It's another way to get better value. You literally vectorize your own corpus of data. You take that data now, you feed it into a frontier model, and now you can get correct answers based. Because you all know this, right? If you've got an HR hiring and firing system of record data, you don't go out to ChatGPT and say, give me the detailed steps to hire, Steve, fire Steve. Well, you'd want to hire Steve, not fire him. Right? Like, you could, but like, you're going to get in a lot of trouble, right? But what you might want to do is take that corpus of data, vectorize it in a system that looks very much like the frontier model that you're going to ask the question. Go search that, take the paragraphs that get real close to the right answer, then put it in something like GPT-4.1 or O3, and then ask the question. And guess what happens? You get your answers very close. but then you still calibrate it. You got to manage your models. And I said, dear CIO, you don't want 30 rags out there. You don't want your developers just, well, here's the first thing. You're going to have Jupyter notebooks. I would predict people who don't get ahead of this thing will be sitting in 2 years from now in their organization with like 10,000 Jupyter notebooks, all in everybody's wherever. Non-managed, no pipelines, right? And then they're probably going to have thousands of models that they're using. No, not keeping. Like your models, any model that you use should be in, I'm a big fan of Artifactory. If you've got an alternative choice, God bless you. It has to be an Artifactory. It has to be part of your pipeline. If you're using a embedding model, you need to have that shod, proved, and I need to know that that was the inference that was used when you got this answer. We talk about agentic protocols, right? MCP isn't the only thing in town. There's an A2A by Google, which actually is a mesh version, which I think is actually a little better than MCP, but both are good. And then you need to manage your language models. You know, one of my clients, the first thing they do is they set up a gateway where they connect a gateway with Okta, and you cannot get to any frontier model, SaaS, without connecting through that to figure out who you are, and now you can go to the corporate licensing agreements they have, and they can direct you to the ones that you want to use, and they can do a lot more. So from the evaluation stuff, just a quick thing. These are things, there's science behind checking. Like, this isn't just vaporware. There is science that you can use in your pipeline to calibrate the percentage of QA correctness, the percentage of hallucinations, the percentage of toxicity. This stuff's been around for years. So when somebody tells you that you you can't use AI because it hallucinates, and your CEO says you must use AI, then you ask the policy organization, what acceptable risk are you willing to take if we're going to use AI? And that risk can be calibrated by these tools. So the risk might be that this is a high consequence answer bot, but the risk policy says we can tolerate a 5% incorrect answer. Right? And then all you got to do is prove is every time you change anything in that pipeline that you tested that it's still measured out at that level. So, like I said, RAG is not dead. I would say that there are there's things called CAG, which is sort of a cache augmented generator. There's GraphRag. There's just a lot of tools that you can use to create that sort of HR example I talked about, like your own corpus of data. But you have to be very specific. So, by the way, there is already a group creating AI S-bombs. How many people have heard of S-bombs? Only a couple. All right, well, then this doesn't make as much sense, unfortunately. But if you understand what an S-bomb is, then you can realize that there is a group that's trying to figure out, like, the things I'm talking about, your models, if it's an open source model, the weights, the data. I think Snowden said the other day models are useless if you don't have the data, but also you need the weights. Like, these are open source. Open source actually takes a whole other meaning in AI. It's not just the code, because the code is actually useless. Just because some provider gives you the code to like Minstrel or one of these things, that gives you nothing. The holy grail is how they train the model, and they call those the weights. Anyway, so just the protocols. I mean, if you're going to have an AI presentation and you don't talk about MCP, you failed. So, but again, I think you'll get the slides. I think that's actually IBM has an interesting approach here to this, with a little different than MCP. But I think Google has always had this right. They've sort of created Istio. They didn't create Envoy, but Istio, the service mesh. Their version of MCP is a mesh, a point-to-point or agent-to-agent. And so to end this discussion with the 10 minutes I have left. So I'm writing this book about the history of AI, and I think it's important to understand the history. And I did your crash course, which I feel guilty if you don't know any of this stuff, but maybe you got to do your homework. But one of my good friends, John Willis, one of the frontier guys of DevOps, challenged me, and he works with one of the smartest cognition or safety science people on the planet, Dr. Woods. And they asked me if I would sort of not be a rah-rah of ChatGPT. And they didn't understand what I was writing, because I'm not. The only point of ChatGPT in my book is, what would 100 years to get us there? And so you understand that. But they asked me to sort of think about an epistemological view. And if you watch that panel with Snowden today, I'm sure he wouldn't show up to my presentation, but like, I already had this in my slide. It's in my epilogue of my book. He talked about abductive reasoning. I'll get into that in a minute, and it's what's missing. But I wanted to sort of talk about what is really important, the history of AI, because I don't think you'll understand all the changes that are happening on a daily basis if you don't know what symbolic versus sub-symbolic, what was the route that it took to get from Deep Blue to here, what was the route to get to AlphaGo from here. All those things will help you better understand these, because there's a lot of shifts coming. There's a question of whether neural networks are even the right answer right now, right? Which is what, or let me say this more specifically. The T in GPT is called transformers. There's a lot of arguments that, and even by the guys that created it, that we're probably going to see another horizon that doesn't include transformer, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening. I will contend you need to know the history. But I think you also need to think about this stuff, not in terms of whether it's AGI or not, or it's ASI. You need to think about it in terms of the way we think about, so I'm a big student of Deming, which lean, so you go agile, lean, Toyota Production Systems. There's one common thread of all those things, and it's scientific method. It's epistemology. It's evidence-based. And I think right now we're just spending too much time with people arguing about we can't do this without a good description of why, or it will be this without sort of an epistemological, hypothesis-driven approach. And so a friend of mine challenged me as I was thinking about this. He said, to study science, you have to understand the philosophy of science. I can't imagine anybody would disagree with that. So to study AI, you have to understand the philosophy of AI. And I think that we're not doing that. And in fact, we're stealing time from that conversation by arguing whether AI is going to replace programmers, or is AI going to replace humans, or if we're stuck with this science fiction version meme of the Terminator. What I came to the conclusion was, over the 100 years that I discuss in my book, there has been this is a sub-theme in my book, which is, it's been a human quest to create a thinking machine. Yep, I mean, going back from Turing to Walter Pitts Micheal, to Rosenblatt, to John McCarthy, to Herbert Simon, all these people who are covered in my book. But the one thing I think we didn't realize, we never occurred to us, that we might build a machine that doesn't think like us. So you've heard the word social technical announced all day long today and yesterday, right? And most people think social is the human, technical is the non-human. Right? Well, there's a middle piece now, which is what I would call an alien cognition. I know this might hurt your head, but we have created a new engine of cognition. You can't argue that it doesn't have a cognition. It just isn't a human cognition. So anybody see the movie Arrival? Good, a few enough people. If you haven't, probably watch, but I'll give you the quick. So what happens is these aliens land about 15 of these hepapods all over the earth, and they start saying a couple of words that we interpret. We can't understand what the hell. It's all science fiction, right? And so the military is all freaking out, I don't know what to hear, and one of the words sound like war, so I don't know. So they contact this woman who's the top linguistics. I hate to say it. She does linguistics and science of linguistics, and they ask her. They say, "Hey, we need you to interpret and figure out how to talk to these aliens." And she says to the general, "I need to meet them." And oh no, you can't do that. And then so he goes visit somebody else, and she said, "Before you go, ask them what the Sanskrit meaning of the word war is." So next day, the general comes back, says, "Come on, get in the helicopter, we're going." And she sort of chuckles and says, "What was his answer?" And he said, to argue. And the truth, the actual answer was more cows. Right? So here's the thing, what she didn't do, and then she spent a lot of theory and knowledge trying to figure out, do they think in a different time? Do they think, she explored a lot of opportunities. What she didn't do is the nonsense we're doing today with AGI, which is we're saying, okay, like this is my sort of alternate narrative of what she would have got there and said, can you ride a bicycle? Can you do math as good as us? Like those are the wrong questions. But those are all the questions we're asking right now of artificial intelligence. Right? We're not thinking about this as a new form of a cognition that can enable us, or how do we guardrail it, all those things. We're playing this silly game that we've gotten from a meme of science fiction movies, from 2001 Space Odyssey to the Terminator, and we're just doing this thing about, comparing it to a human, and it's not a human. It's an alien form of cognition. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and then Snowden talked about this. So if you think about like the structure of like AI, there's expert systems, and by the way, they're not going away. There's called symbolic neural networks, which actually combine the two together. But you could say that's basically an expert system, a deductive logic, right? And Stone said this today in the panel, and I agree completely, that basically our neural networks are inductive. Those are correlation. And again, when people talk about hallucinations, it means that just like we do when we do inductive logic, like, you know what, it was every time I wake up in the morning, the driveway is all wet. It must have rained last night, right? I mean, that's basically what neural networks do at an incredible scale. The thing that none of them do is the magic that a human has, which is called abductive reasoning. That's the sort of thing that, like, if you're old enough to remember the Columbo character, he'd walk into a murder scene and be like, yeah, it's that guy. Like, wait a minute, like, why do you think? Well, there was some mud on his shoes, and I've seen this pattern. Like, so the missing piece, and there's a great book called The Myth of AI by Eric Larson, where he literally spends a lot of time discussing abductive reasoning, and the philosophy of abductive reasoning comes from something called pragmatism. And again, I think that's the thing we need to have I had chills when Snowden messaged, but he said this out loud, and I've been having these conversations with a couple of people right now about this is the missing part of the conversation with AI, right? So again, we have to add some science. We have to learn from our science. I'm a Deming guy, so I will at least bore you with, I think, Deming's theory of system of profound knowledge and how it applies. If you don't know who Deming is, this doesn't make any sense. And I just end like on the philosophy of AI question. Stop wasting your time talking about AI. And anytime somebody's talking about AGI, go to the other side of the room and do something with AI to figure out how to interact with it, to learn how it's going to be useful and how you need to guardrail it. Anyway, that's, I don't have time for this story, but this is a great story. So there was basically 4 people who could have been the Beatles of AI, and we probably would have got ChatGPT 20 years earlier, but we're broken up because of a petty argument between somebody's daughter and somebody else. That's it. Well, thank you so much, y'all.
Now? John, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
All right, good stuff.
Let's see if we have a couple of questions for you. In the meantime, for those of you that are interested in the raffle, there is a raffle going on in the main room right now, but if you want to hear some answers to some questions, do we have any questions at all? Common. We are talking about regular people here, CIOs. We are unable to cope with this speed, as they care about business too amongst everything else. Who is even able to win the race? The key CIO competencies here. Your thoughts, tips? Yeah,
I think the biggest sort of lesson is, stop being in denial. That paper that is sort of a short novella, which is the CIO is smart enough to know, even though the CEO hired a chief AI officer, she was going to go over there and basically plant herself in that conversation. First, she learned enough to plant herself in the conversation because she knew things were going to go wrong. By the way, when you fail an audit, they're not going to the chief AI officer. They're going to the CISO and the CIO, right? So it's the CIO first, the denial. You can't put your head in the sand because you think the CEO doesn't want you to talk to them. And it's your responsibility to do what you do. You know, when people ask me, are you the DevOps guy or this, I think what I've been doing for 45 years is helping organizations protect their brand. I think DevOps is about protecting the brand. I think audit and security about protecting the brand. And so the question then is, if this thing is inevitable, which it is, how do we protect the brand? And so we have to get our CIO on board by either nudging. I mean, the DevOps movement, there weren't a whole lot of CIOs that were into, you know how many times I would give a presentation where somebody come up to me, John, I work for a 100,000 person organization, and my C-level people will never understand this. I'm like, all right, here's what you do. You buy a physical copy of the DevOps handbook, you give it to them, you tell them that you must read it. Guess what they don't do? They don't read it. But you go back a week later, 2 weeks later, hey, have you read it? By the third time you ask that question, they feel guilty that you spent $20 on your own book. They read it, and they're like, I get it. So you have to be those people for your CIO, right? Like you have to, we have to educate our organization. And sometimes we're the lone wolf, sometimes we're part of a big pack, but you can't sort of ignore this stuff. You just can't. Because the downside, I think, on this one is existential existence to your corporation if you don't get it right. I think that's it.
That's it. John.
Yeah.
We at Craft Hub would like to give you a little token of our appreciation.
All right. Well, great. Thank you.
For coming and sharing your knowledge with us.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.
All right.
Another big round of applause.